I never thought the sound of my own child's voice could break me. But that morning it did. He called me mother. Not mom, not ma, not the name he used to shout from the backyard when he was hungry or scared. Just mother. Sharp. Formal. Distant. Mother, he said, we've been thinking. It might be time for you to sell the house. Just like that. As if the word home meant nothing. As if the years, the memories, the walls David built with his bare hands were just pieces of wood that could be traded for convenience. I remember staring at the phone in silence, feeling the weight of every sacrifice I had made pressing against my chest. He kept talking, something about it being for my safety, about me not needing so much space now. But all I could hear was the echo of my late husband's laughter bouncing off these same walls, and the sound of my little boy's footsteps running down the hallway, chasing after a paper airplane. Now they wanted to sell it. My home. My life. Everything that was left of us. I didn't argue. I just said, all right, Ethan. If you think that's what's best. He sounded relieved, as if he had been bracing for a fight. But I'd learned a long time ago, sometimes silence hurts louder than words ever could. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, the receiver still in my hand. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like judgment. Sighed, the wind carried the sound of children laughing somewhere far away. Once that used to be us. When my husband, David, passed away 15 years ago, I thought the worst pain of my life had already come and gone. But grief is a teacher that never stops testing you. I had raised Ethan alone. Worked double shifts at the library, skipped dinners, patched the same coat winter after winter, all so he could have the life we dreamed for him. I thought that kind of love built unshakable loyalty. I thought sons who grew up watching their mothers break their backs for them would never forget. But love, I've learned, is not memory. It's convenience. People hold on to it as long as it serves them. When Ethan met Lily, I was happy for him. She was beautiful, poised, and knew exactly how to make a room notice her. She held my hands the first day we met and said, "I've heard so much about you, Mom." Her smile was perfect, maybe too perfect. In the beginning, I told myself to be patient. She was young, finding her way, and perhaps I was just too old-fashioned. But small things began to chip away at my peace. She'd call my home quaint, like it was an exhibit from a forgotten decade. She'd bring dishes when they visited, one she'd cooked herself, and gently suggest I shouldn't strain myself anymore. And when Ethan started spending less time here, she'd say it was because he needed balance. Balance. That's what they call distance when it benefits them. Months passed before I realized I was being erased slowly, not with cruelty but with charm. Every decision they made was wrapped in kindness. Every insult wore perfume. I watched my son slip away, not in anger but in obedience. Obedience to a woman who knew exactly how to pull the strings of his guilt and love. He began calling less, visiting rarely. On holidays, they'd stop by for an hour, her eyes scanning the house like a realtor, his phone always buzzing in his pocket. When I'd tell him stories about his childhood, he'd smile, distracted, and say, "You've told me that one before, Mom." And then the conversation would drift like smoke. I started saving the good china again, just in case they came for dinner. But the plates stayed clean. Then last week they came in person. Lily carried a folder in her hands, papers neatly clipped, her nails painted pale pink. She smiled sweetly and said, "We've been talking, Mom. This house is too much for you. We just want you to be safe." Finn nodded, his eyes soft, avoiding mine. I could see the guilt swimming in them, but not enough to drown him. She continued, her voice silky and calm. "We thought maybe if we sell the house, we can put that money toward a smaller place near us. You'll have people around, less to worry about." I looked at her, at the way she said we. The way she spoke as if I were the guest in my own life. And I realized something. They weren't asking. They were informing me. So I said nothing. I just smiled, the kind of smile that made Lily's eyes flicker for half a second. And I said, If that's what you think is best, dear. 'Cause when a storm comes, you don't fight the wind. You let it blow and you watch what it destroys. After they left, I walked through every room of this house. Kitchen, where David once danced with me while soup burned on the stove. The living room, where Ethan took his first steps. The garden, where I buried the letters David wrote from his construction site when he couldn't come home for weeks. Every inch of this house was a memory carved into wood. And they wanted to sell it. I sat in the quiet until evening fell. The sun dipped low, spilling orange light through the windows, and I felt David's absence more than ever. That kind of loneliness doesn't have sound, it just hums beneath your ribs like a secret ache. I opened the old chest at the foot of my bed, the one David built. Inside were photos, yellowed receipts, a few trinkets, and a stack of envelopes tied with ribbon. One of them caught my eye. It was different, unmarked, sealed, but with my name written in David's handwriting. I must have seen it before, long ago, and forgotten. But now, holding it, I felt something cold and electric crawl through me. For years I thought he'd left me with nothing but love. But maybe he left me with more than that. That night I sat by the window, the unopened letter resting on my lap. I didn't open it, not yet. Some truths need to be earned, not rushed. I watched the streetlights flicker outside, the wind stirring the old curtains, and I heard David's voice in my mind, clear as the day he died. Marianne, never let them mistake your silence for surrender. That night, I finally understood what he meant. Because silence isn't weakness. It's patience sharpening itself. And when the time comes, it cuts deeper than anger ever could. After that night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt louder, the tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even the sigh of the wind outside. It was as if the house itself was reminding me that time was still moving, even when my heart wasn't. I kept that letter on my nightstand. I'd look at it every few hours, wondering what truth David had locked inside those folds of paper. But I couldn't bring myself to break the seal. Some part of me still needed to remember him the way he was, alive, laughing, and sure of us. So instead, I let my mind drift back to the days when life still felt kind. David wasn't a rich man, but he was the kind that made poverty feel safe. He built our first home with his own hands. 2 bedrooms, a leaky roof, and a garden full of wild roses that grew wherever they wanted, stubborn and beautiful like us. On summer nights, we'd sit on the porch after Ethan was asleep. David would rest his calloused hand over mine and say, "One day, when he's grown, this will be his place too. Everything I build for both of you." I never forgot those words. They were promises carved into the foundation of this house. But promises like wood crack with time. Ethan was a bright child, quiet, gentle, too kind for his own good. He'd follow David everywhere, mimicking the way his father walked, the way he talked. When David died, Ethan was 16. A boy standing in a man's shadow, trying not to cry in front of people. He carried his father's hammer to the funeral. He said he wanted to finish what Dad started. And I believed him. I thought that grief would make him stronger, closer to me. But instead, it made him restless. After high school, he wanted to leave town. "Just for college, Mom," he said. "I'll come back." And I let him go, even though my heart clenched with every mile that separated us. I worked longer hours to pay for his tuition. Every paycheck was a piece of my health my years. But it didn't matter. I told myself that's what mothers do. Came home less and less. First for Christmas, then only for birthdays, and then not at all. I'd wait by the window, pretending to read. Sometimes when I heard a car slow down outside, I'd imagine it was him. But it never was. When he did call, he always sounded rushed. There was always someone in the background, always a reason to hang up early. Until one day he mentioned her, Lily. He said she worked in marketing, that she was ambitious, sharp, nothing like the people back home. And in that sentence I heard it. That invisible line between home and back home. Between me and them. The first time I met her, I wanted to believe she was good for him. She dressed well, spoke with confidence, and looked at Ethan the way women look at men they believe they can shape. I told myself that was just how modern women were, assertive, direct, full of plans, but I didn't like the way she touched things that weren't hers. The way her eyes lingered too long on the furniture, the photos, the house itself. When I offered her tea, she smiled politely and said she preferred coffee, something stronger. And I remember thinking, yes, stronger than you should be. Ethan was different around her. He laughed more but softer. He looked happy but distant, as if happiness came with conditions now. And every time I tried to talk to him alone, she found a reason to stay close. One night after dinner, I overheard them in the kitchen. She said, "Your mom means well, but she holds on to things too much." And he replied, "She's just old-fashioned." I stood there in the hallway, feeling invisible in my own home. Old-fashioned. That's what they call you when your love no longer fits their lives. Months passed and small changes began to appear. The gifts stopped coming. The visits turned into obligations. And when they did come, Lily would insist on taking photos of us, of the house, of everything. She'd post them online with captions like, "Family time with the in-laws." I'd smile, though something inside me twisted each time. Because it wasn't family time, it was performance. Till I stayed kind. 'Cause I thought kindness could soften people like her. But kindness without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. And I had surrendered far too often in my life. Last winter, when the pipes burst, I called Ethan. He promised to come that weekend, but he didn't. Instead, Lily called. Her voice was sweet as honey. "Mom," she said, "maybe it's time to sell and move into an apartment. You shouldn't have to deal with maintenance anymore." I remember holding the phone and staring at the ceiling, water dripping through the cracks above me. And I thought, how quickly care turns into convenience. I thanked her, told her I'd handle it. And I did. I fixed the pipes myself, with the same hands that once braided Ethan's hair and mended his school uniforms. When the water ran clear again, I cried. Not from exhaustion, from pride. 'Cause for the first time in years, I remembered I was capable. That letter from David stayed on my nightstand for a week. Sometimes I'd hold it to my chest, feeling the faint texture of his handwriting beneath my fingers. Felt alive somehow, like a pulse waiting to be heard. I imagined what it might say. Maybe it was just a note of love. Maybe instructions. Maybe a secret. But every time I thought of Ethan and Lily's faces when they spoke about selling this house, something in me hardened. If David had left me something, anything, maybe it was time to find out. Till I waited. Because before you open a door like that, you have to be ready for what's on the other side. The night before I finally decided, I dreamed of David. He stood in the doorway, his work clothes covered in dust, smiling the way he used to after long days. He didn't say a word. He just pointed toward the chest at the foot of the bed, the one that held his letters. And then I woke up. The room was quiet. The air heavy. I knew it was time. The next morning I brewed coffee, sat by the window, and stared at the envelope one last time. The seal was fragile now, brittle with age. I ran my thumb across the edge and stopped. 'Cause in that moment I heard Ethan's voice again from the phone that day. "We just want what's best for you, Mother." And suddenly I understood. They didn't want what was best for me. They wanted what was left of him. The legacy. The land. Quiet little house that still carried his name. I took a deep breath and tore the envelope open. Inside there was only one page, folded neatly, yellowed with time. It began with his handwriting. "If you're reading this, Marianne, it means life has tested you again. I couldn't give you riches, but I made sure you'd never be left with nothing." My hand shook as I read. His words were calm, practical, the way he always was. He explained things I never knew. About the deed. About a trust. About a will that wasn't as simple as everyone thought. And then, at the bottom of the page, he wrote, Promise me you'll stay silent until you need to speak. The day you do, they'll finally know who you really are. I pressed the paper to my heart, and for the first time since he died, I felt him near. Sighed, the morning light filled the room. Everything looked softer, even the cracks in the walls. I realized something then. They could sell the furniture. They could take the curtains, the dishes, the pictures. But they could never take what David had already secured. They thought I was weak. But weakness, I've learned, is just strength that hasn't spoken yet. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the chest, and smiled. Not out of joy, out of certainty. 'Cause the day was coming when silence would no longer protect them. It would expose them. There's a certain quiet that follows humiliation. It's not peace. It's not acceptance. It's the kind of silence that hums in your bones, like something inside you has been rearranged. For weeks after that dinner, I stopped speaking unless I had to. Not out of pride, but because my words had begun to echo back to me. Small and useless. Every sound in the house became louder. The clang of a spoon, the slam of a cupboard, the laughter that wasn't meant for me. Sometimes I'd stand at the kitchen doorway and watch them on the couch. Her, with her head on his shoulder. Him, smiling in a way I didn't recognize. I'd think, that's my boy. And then I'd feel the ache twist again. Because he wasn't anymore. One afternoon, as I was folding his childhood blanket, a faded thing with tiny blue stars, I found something inside it. Corner of a photo. Old and torn, but familiar. It was from the day he'd graduated high school. His father had been there that day. And I remembered how proud he was. How he'd whispered, "He's the best thing we ever made." I sat on the edge of my bed holding that photo until the light outside dimmed. And I realized I wasn't just grieving my son. I was grieving the woman I used to be. Strange what we learn to tolerate. The small comments. The side glances. The way she'd take the phone when it rang. And say, "She's resting." Even when I wasn't. When guests came, she'd introduce me like an afterthought. "This is my husband's mother." Not mama, not ama, not even mom. Just his mother. A label. A thing. And my son, he never corrected her. He just smiled politely, as if it were easier to let me fade than to confront her. But I noticed things. Little things. The way she'd open my drawers when she thought I wasn't looking. The hushed phone calls. The new car in the driveway that my son couldn't afford. The jewelry she wore, pieces that looked too much like mine. I told myself I was imagining it. That age was making me paranoid. Until one night I woke to a sound. A drawer sliding open in the next room. I didn't move. I just listened. Footsteps. Soft. Careful. And then her voice, whispering to someone on the phone. She won't even notice, I swear. It's all just lying there. My stomach turned cold. She wasn't stealing from me, not yet. She was studying me. Learning how invisible I could be. A few days later, a brown envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed to me in a handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Shaky, slanted, like the hand of a ghost. Inside was a letter. My husband's name at the top. Dated the week before he died. For a long time I couldn't breathe. He had never mentioned a letter. Not once. I sat down in the old armchair, the one he used to fall asleep in after dinner, and began to read. "My dear Mina," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer beside you. I know you. You'll keep this family together even when it breaks you to do it. But I want you to promise me something. Don't let love turn you into a servant. Our boy is kind, but he will forget your sacrifices if you make them too quietly." I stopped there. My eyes blurred. I could still hear his voice. Steady, practical, full of a quiet tenderness I hadn't heard in years. The letter continued. There are things you don't know about this house, about the will. If you ever feel alone, if the boy ever turns against you, go to the study. The second drawer. You'll find the papers there. Everything will make sense. My hands trembled. I had never opened that drawer. After his death, I couldn't bear to touch his things. Felt sacred, untouchable. That night, I waited until they went to bed. The house fell into its usual rhythm. Her laughter muffled behind their closed door. His heavy footsteps crossing the hallway. When the light under their door finally went dark, I went to the study. The drawer was stiff with dust. I pulled it open and found a bundle of papers tied with a thin blue ribbon. Underneath it, a small metal key. Old. Rusted. With a tag that said only, Locker D47. I took the papers and key back to my room, locking the door behind me like a thief in my own house. The documents were legal, property deeds, bank slips, and a will. Not the one I'd seen years ago, but a newer one signed and witnessed. And in it, he had left everything to me. The house, the land, the savings, everything. My breath caught. All this time I'd assumed we shared everything equally. But he had known. He had known I'd need protection, not from strangers, but from the very people I loved. I folded the letter carefully, pressed it to my chest, and whispered, "You always knew, didn't you?" The next morning I made breakfast as usual. She was scrolling through her phone, complaining about bills. My son walked in half-dressed, late for work, and said, "Ma, can you transfer a little from your account? Just until next week?" I looked up from the stove. The smell of burning toast filled the air. And for the first time in months, I smiled. "Of course, Beta," I said softly. "But let's talk tonight. I have something to show you." He nodded, distracted, and left with his usual kiss on my forehead. Kiss that once meant love. Now it just felt like guilt. As the door closed, she looked at me over her coffee mug. A smirk, small, poisonous. "Don't make him worry, okay? He's under a lot of stress." I just nodded, because she didn't know what I'd found. She didn't know that the woman she thought was powerless was finally holding every piece of the board. That evening, I took out the key again. Gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Locker D47. It was from the old bank, the one where my husband used to work before he died. I hadn't been there in years. But now, I felt the air shift. Something inside me. Something that had been sleeping. Third awake. I didn't feel like a guest anymore. I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like a woman who was finally about to stand. And as I placed the key in my pocket, I thought, let them laugh. Let them believe I'm small. Because soon they'll remember why I stayed silent. There's a strange calm that comes when you stop being afraid. It's not loud. It doesn't feel like victory. It's more like the stillness before a storm. Kind that makes birds go quiet and makes you listen closer than ever before. That morning, I woke up before sunrise. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. I made tea the way I used to when my husband was alive. Strong 2 spoons of sugar and poured into the chipped blue cup he'd always used. The key lay on the table beside it. Old cold waiting. Locker D47. By the time the sky had lightened, I was dressed and ready. I didn't tell them I was leaving. I just wrote a note on the counter. Going to the temple. It was the only excuse that never invited questions. The air outside was sharp and clean. It felt like it had been a lifetime since I'd stepped out with purpose. Each step toward that bank was like walking back into the woman I used to be. The bank hadn't changed much. Same glass doors, same smell of disinfectant and old paper. When I handed the key to the clerk, he looked at it, squinted, and said, This locker's been inactive for a long time, ma'am. Let me check. He disappeared into the back. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from something else. Anticipation, maybe. Or the sense that everything I'd been enduring was finally about to make sense. After a few minutes, he returned with a ledger. Yes, locker D47, he said, scanning down the page. Registered under your husband's name. Secondary access granted to Mrs. Mina. He looked up at me, smiling politely. That's you, right? I nodded. He gestured for me to follow him into the vault room. Cold, dim, lined with tiny doors of steel. When he left me alone with the locker, the silence felt sacred. I turned the key, clicked with a sound that felt final, like unlocking not just a box but a truth that had been waiting. Inside was a brown envelope, a small black diary, and a folded piece of paper with my name written in his handwriting. I sat down on the metal chair in the corner and opened the letter first. Mina, if you are reading this, then something has happened to me sooner than expected. I didn't tell you about this locker because I wanted to protect you from the vultures that would circle after I'm gone. Inside the diary, you'll find the details of all the assets, not the ones everyone knows about, but the ones we never declared publicly. You know why. If our son turns against you, and I fear he might, don't be afraid to stand your ground. You've given him love, shelter, and everything a mother could. If he forgets that, remind him, gently but firmly, that you are not to be pitied. I stopped there. A tear rolled down my cheek and dropped onto the page. He had known. He had seen what I could not, the weakness growing inside our boy, the dependency, the ease with which love can be twisted into entitlement. The diary was neat, organized, each page dated, signed, almost like a confession. It listed hidden accounts, investments, and at the very end, one entry circled in red ink. In case of emergency, transfer everything to Mina's name. She will know what to do. Close the diary slowly, the sound echoing in that cold, quiet room. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity, about remembering that I was never just someone's mother or someone's burden. When I reached home, she was in the living room, her phone pressed to her ear, laughing. The kind of laughter that used to come from my son. Where were you? She asked, voice sharp, eyes still on her screen. The temple, I said softly. She nodded, uninterested, and went back to her conversation. I watched her for a moment. How easily she owned the air in that house. How comfortable she'd grown walking through rooms that weren't hers. Later that evening, my son came home. He looked tired, but there was something else. Something uneasy behind his eyes. Ma, he said, sitting down beside me. There's something we need to talk about. I nodded, though I already knew where this was going. He hesitated, then sighed. Ria and I have been looking at houses. Something bigger, closer to the city. We were thinking maybe you could sell this one. Move with us. It'll be easier for everyone. Sell this house. The words landed like stones. This house, the one my husband had built brick by brick, the one where every wall held a memory, every corner a story. I looked at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. And that's when I saw it. The same weakness his father had warned me about. I smiled gently, my voice steady. Of course, Beta. But before we decide, I have something to show you. He looked confused, but nodded. That night, when they were both seated at the dinner table, I placed the black diary between us. Neither spoke. I opened it, turned it toward them, and pointed to the red-circled page. This, I said quietly, is your father's handwriting. These are his words, his wishes, his plans for us. My son frowned, leaning closer. She looked impatient, her hand tightening around her glass. What is this, Ma? He asked. It's the truth, I said. Your father left everything to me. Not to you. And not to her. To me. For a moment, no one moved. Clock ticked. The wind outside howled softly through the half-open window. Then she laughed. A brittle, cutting sound. That's ridiculous. That old man's will was changed years ago. I turned my gaze on her, steady, cold. This isn't the old will, I said. This is the one he signed after the accident. The one none of you knew about. She blinked. My son looked between us, confusion turning to disbelief. Ma, are you saying? I'm saying, I interrupted gently, that this house, this land, everything, belongs to me. And I'm not selling it. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Her face turned pale. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then pushed back from the table. Why didn't you tell me this before? He asked finally, his voice breaking somewhere between anger and shame. Because, I said, you weren't ready to listen. Later that night, I heard them arguing behind closed doors. Her voice sharp, his quieter, defeated. The walls carried every word. She's lying, she hissed. You said everything was in your name. I don't know, Ria. I don't know. Well, you'd better find out before she ruins everything we've built. The slam of a door followed. Then footsteps. Then silence. I sat in my room, the letter from my husband open on my lap. And for the first time in years, I felt safe. Not because of the money, not because of the power, but because I finally remembered who I was. Mina, wife, mother, widow, and the keeper of everything he'd built. A woman who had stayed silent not because she was weak, but because she was waiting. And now, the waiting was over. But peace doesn't last long when pride is wounded. And as the days passed, I could feel it. The shift in the air. The way she stopped looking at me. Quiet between my son and me stretching into something cold. Something was coming. And deep down, I knew. This was only the beginning. Silence has its own kind of violence. It doesn't shout. Seeps. And in this house it had begun to spread like fog, thick, invisible, choking everything warm that once lived here. After that night at the dinner table, things were never the same. She stopped pretending to be polite. And he stopped pretending to see me. They would whisper in their room late into the night. The sound of muffled voices, hurried sentences, followed by the soft slam of a door when one of them stormed out. I could tell he was torn, still my boy somewhere deep inside, but the strings of his heart were now being pulled by hands that didn't know love, only control. Sometimes I'd walk into the kitchen in the morning and find the sugar jar half empty, the way she knew I liked it full. Small things. Little reminders that I was no longer welcome in my own home. First, I told myself to ignore it, to be patient. A mother's heart always finds excuses for her child. But when patience turns into surrender, love begins to rot. And I had promised myself I would never rot quietly again. One afternoon, I overheard them talking in the living room. They thought I was in the backyard drying clothes. But the window was open, and the wind carried every word straight to me. She's manipulating you, Ria said, her voice sharp, cutting. You don't see it because she's your mother, but she's doing this on purpose, keeping everything in her name so you have to beg for it later. He didn't respond at first. Then, softly, almost brokenly, he said, She wouldn't do that. Ria laughed. A short, bitter laugh that didn't sound like a woman in love. It sounded like a woman in battle. Oh, darling, she said, she already has. Teacup in my hand trembled. For a moment I couldn't breathe. That was the first time I realized she wasn't just cruel. She was clever. And clever people don't destroy you with noise, they do it with doubt. From that day, things began to vanish. Not valuables, she was too smart for that. Just the little things that kept my days together. My reading glasses from the nightstand. The shawl my husband had given me on our last anniversary. The framed photograph of the three of us, once kept on the mantel, quietly replaced by a new one, of just the two of them. When I asked her about it, she smiled sweetly and said, "Oh, maybe you misplaced it. You forget things sometimes, right, Ma?" She always said "Ma" like a curse disguised as affection. I didn't answer. I simply nodded. 'Cause sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's a mirror. And I wanted her to see her own reflection in mine. But it wasn't her cruelty that broke me. It was my son's silence. One night I walked past his room and heard him speaking on the phone. His voice was low, tired. "I can't keep living like this, Ria," he said. "She's always watching, always judging. You don't know what it's like." My chest tightened. For a second I thought I might faint. That voice, that tone, it wasn't anger. It was embarrassment. He was ashamed of me. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the doorframe, and in that instant I saw the truth. He wasn't the boy I raised. He was a man who no longer recognized his own mother unless she fit the picture his wife painted of her. I turned away, went back to my room, and sat in the dark for a long time. The next morning, I did what I hadn't done in months. I dressed carefully, pressed my sari, wore my gold earrings, the ones Ria always said were too old-fashioned. And when I walked into the kitchen, she was there, leaning against the counter, phone in hand. She looked up, startled. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with surprise. "Where are you going, Ma?" I smiled. "Nowhere. Just feeling like myself today." She studied me, eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't like it. Confidence, I've learned, is the one thing manipulators can't tolerate. It reminds them of what they can't control. She forced a laugh. "Well, don't overdo it. You know your age." I kept smiling. "Age doesn't stop a person from remembering who they are," I said softly. And then I walked past her. That evening, my son came home early. He barely looked at me. Dinner was quiet, too quiet. Afterward, as I cleared the plates, I heard her whisper something to him. He nodded. Then he turned to me. "Ma," he said, "Ria's parents are coming to stay for a few weeks. We'll need the guest room." "The guest room?" I asked, pretending not to understand. "Yes. We thought maybe you could move your things into the storage room for a while." For a moment, everything went still. Plate in my hand felt suddenly heavy, like a piece of my heart. I looked at him, at the boy who once couldn't sleep unless I sang him lullabies. And now he was asking me to move into storage. I set the plate down carefully, my fingers trembling just slightly. "Of course," I said softly. "If that's what you want." Ria smiled, triumphant. She reached for his hand, squeezing it as if she'd just won a game. But inside me, something shifted. Not pain, not fear. Something older, wiser, the quiet realization that no matter how deep their cruelty went, I still held the ground they walked on. And they didn't even know it. That night, as I packed my things into boxes, I came across the letter from my husband again. I read it under the dim light of the bedside lamp. "If our son forgets you, let him. Some lessons are learned only in silence." I folded it carefully and placed it in my pocket, because I knew now what my silence was meant for. It wasn't to protect them anymore. It was to protect the truth, until it was ready to be heard. The next few days passed slowly. Her parents arrived, loud, proud, filled with opinions about how I should enjoy my retirement. I smiled through every meal, answered every backhanded compliment with grace, and watched quietly as she performed her little act of hospitality, the perfect daughter-in-law, the devoted wife. But when they all left for a weekend trip, I finally exhaled. The house was mine again, if only for 2 days. I went to my room, my storage room, and opened the small wooden trunk where I kept the diary. I read every line again, memorizing every number, every name, every detail of the plan my husband had left behind. And then I closed it and whispered to myself, "It's time. 'Cause when love fails to teach, life does." And I was done teaching with kindness. Now it was time to teach with silence. They thought they'd taken everything from me, my home, my dignity, my son. But what they didn't know was that I was still here. Still watching. Still waiting. And one day, very soon, they would remember exactly why I had stayed silent. The days began blending into each other, like the same gray cloth folded again and again until it lost all shape. Mina no longer heard laughter in her home. No television noise. No music from the old radio she once played while cooking. Only whispers, small, cutting, untraceable. Ria had mastered the art of gentle cruelty. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw things. Instead, she replaced the sugar with salt in Mina's morning tea and smiled when Mina coughed. She rearranged the furniture slightly every day so Mina kept bumping into corners. And when Mina noticed, Ria said softly, "Maybe you're just getting old, Ma. You forget things now." Her son, once her shadow, once the boy who used to hold her sorry while crossing the road, began to disappear behind his wife's words. He avoided eye contact, spoke in half sentences. When Mina asked if he'd like her to make his favorite lentil curry, he said, "Ria doesn't like that smell." That one sentence, simple, unintentional, felt like the sound of a door closing forever. At night, Mina could hear them talking in the next room. Their voices low, the rhythm of two people weaving a new world without her in it. Sometimes she caught her name between the murmurs. "She's dramatic, she plays victim, we should get the property in our name soon." Words soaked into her like slow poison. But Mina didn't react. She'd learned that silence could be armor. Instead of crying, she began watching. She watched what Ria touched, what she hid, which drawer she locked. She noticed that her son's bank papers, his old files, his father's documents, had started moving from the cupboard to Ria's personal drawer. One evening, while dusting, Mina found a half-burnt envelope near the backyard trash bin. Inside was a photocopy of the house deed. Her name, once written in proud blue ink by her late husband, had been scratched out in pencil. Next to it, a faint note, "Transfer to Ria's pending." She held the paper for a long time, her hands trembling, her heart strangely calm. It wasn't the betrayal that hurt most, it was the planning. The quiet, day-by-day way they'd begun erasing her existence. That night, Mina didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, the moonlight cutting across her face like a blade. In her lap lay her old wedding photo, black and white, her husband smiling awkwardly beside her. She whispered, "You left me too early, Mohan. They're taking everything you built." Inside, the house was silent. But the silence felt staged, too perfect, like someone holding their breath just behind the wall. Then came the faint click of a phone camera. Mina turned, too late. Ria stood at the doorway, pretending to yawn, her phone half hidden behind her back. "Oh, sorry, Ma," she said with a small smile. "Didn't know you were awake." She walked away before Mina could reply. The next morning, her son confronted her, waving his phone. "Ma, what's this about you telling neighbors we're mistreating you?" Ria showed me screenshots. "You're talking behind our backs now." Mina stared, her lips parting in shock. "I didn't say." But he cut her off. "Don't lie. It's embarrassing." That was how Ria worked. Invisible wounds, visible evidence. She took photos, recorded half-conversations, sent texts pretending to be Mina. And slowly she built a case, a story where Mina was unstable, senile, and cruel. Days later, a social worker arrived, polite, firm, wearing a government badge. "Mrs. Mina Sharma? We received a complaint about elderly neglect from this address." Mina stood frozen. Her son looked confused. Ria stood behind him, pretending to wipe her eyes. "Oh, maybe someone misunderstood. I just worry about her sometimes. She forgets things, leaves the gas on." The social worker smiled politely, jotting notes. Mina didn't argue. She just looked at Ria, long, steady, unblinking. For the first time, Ria looked away. That night, something inside Mina changed. Not anger, not yet. Just clarity. She realized she was no longer living in her home. She was living inside Ria's theater. Every gesture, every word, every silence, all of it had become a performance designed to make her doubt herself. And that was when Mina decided to stop playing the role written for her. She began writing small notes, folded pieces of paper hidden inside her old recipe books. Each note recorded dates, times, and what Ria said or did. She labeled them with simple words: gas turned off by me. Ria said it was left on. Photocopy found in trash, deed altered. Complaint visit, Ria behind it. It wasn't revenge. It was preparation. One morning she found Ria on the phone, whispering to someone, pacing. Yes, she's old. A little confused. We'll take care of the transfer quietly. My husband won't resist if I show him proof she's unstable. Ria hung up as soon as she saw Mina standing there. The others spoke. But that silence, that long, cold silence, became their new battlefield. By evening, Ria told her husband she wanted to redecorate. New curtains. New wall colors. He agreed instantly. And just like that, Mina's wedding photo disappeared from the living room wall. Her husband's chair gone. Even her nameplate on the gate, unscrewed quietly at night. Ria smiled sweetly the next morning. It's time for a fresh start, Ma. You should be happy. Mina didn't reply. She simply looked around the hollowed-out space that once carried her laughter, her prayers, her memories, and whispered under her breath. Yes, a fresh start. But this time the words weren't surrender. They were a promise. Because in Mina's eyes now, there was something Ria had never seen before. Calm. Calculated. Cold. The storm had finally learned to sit still. The first morning of winter came with a fog so thick, the street outside looked erased. Inside that dim house, Mina stood by the window, wrapped in her old wool shawl, her eyes fixed on the blank glass as if watching something only she could see. Behind her, Ria's voice echoed faintly from the kitchen, cheerful and artificial. Ma, we're having guests tonight. Don't say anything embarrassing, okay? Mina didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because now, silence was no longer her cage, it was her weapon. For weeks, she'd watched Ria tighten her grip on the household. She controlled the money, the calls, even what Mina ate. But control was a fragile thing. It cracked quietly under the weight of its own arrogance. That evening, when the guests arrived, a banker couple, friends of Ria's, Mina sat in her corner, knitting, pretending not to hear. But she heard everything. Ria boasted, laughing lightly. Yes, the house will soon be in our name. My husband's mother isn't well, so we're handling the documents. The guests nodded politely, unaware that Mina's hands had stopped moving. Her eyes, hidden behind her glasses, glimmered. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, she took out her notebook. Her neat handwriting filled the pages, each date, each word, each act of deceit. She turned to the last page and wrote in slow, careful ink. Tomorrow, step 1. Began small. That week, Ria received a letter from the electricity department, unpaid bill. Then another from the phone company, overdue. Confused, she stormed through drawers looking for the receipts she swore she'd kept. But they were gone. Mina, from her room, kept knitting. Calmly. Patiently. Because she had found those receipts weeks ago, and locked them in a place no one would ever think to look, the temple drawer beneath her husband's framed photo. Ria grew restless. Then, one morning, her son came home early. Ria, he said, why is there a pending property tax notice? Ma told me she paid it last year. Ria's face paled for a second, then she smiled, quick and false. Oh, it's just a clerical issue. Don't worry. But Mina saw the flicker in her eyes, that small fracture of fear. That night, Mina spoke for the first time in weeks. At dinner, she looked at her son and said softly, "You know, Beta, I found your father's old insurance papers. His signature, his last letter. He mentioned something about never selling this house. Ever." The room froze. Ria's spoon clinked against her plate. Her son frowned. "What do you mean, Ma?" Mina smiled faintly. "You'll see when the lawyer visits." And then she went back to eating, as if she'd just spoken about the weather. Ria didn't sleep that night. She called someone, maybe the same person she'd whispered to before, her voice hushed and urgent. But Mina heard every word. The walls in that house had grown old, thin, and loyal. Over the next few days, Mina's calmness began to unsettle them. She no longer complained, no longer reacted. She simply existed, silently marking every movement, every argument, every false word. Her son, confused by the shift, began softening again. Once, when Ria raised her voice, he interrupted. "Ria, enough. She's still my mother." That was the first time in months he'd said it. And the way Ria's face hardened told Mina something important, that Ria's control was slipping. But Mina knew better than to rush. Vengeance, she understood now, wasn't a loud storm. It was a slow thaw, one that melted everything from within. She started waking earlier than everyone else. She made tea, cleaned the courtyard, greeted the milkman. And one morning she quietly invited the new tenant from across the street, an old retired police clerk, for tea. They talked for an hour. No names, no accusations. Just questions. "Tell me," Mina said, her tone casual, "if someone tries to transfer property using a forged document, what happens?" The man chuckled softly. "If proven, it's a criminal offense, Ani. Even a spouse can't protect the accused." "Why?" Mina smiled. "Oh, nothing. Just curious." By midwinter, Ria's world began unraveling. The forged documents she had hidden? Gone. The social worker who once believed her story? Revisited by Mina, this time with calm evidence. And the whispers around the neighborhood had started shifting. Now Ria's name was being spoken in soft, suspicious tones. Yet in the house, everything remained eerily polite. Mina still cooked, still smiled, still called her Beta. But the air had changed. Ria could feel it, that sense of being watched by the very walls she once commanded. One afternoon, as Mina folded laundry, Ria approached her. Her voice was calm but shaking slightly. "Ma, I think you've misunderstood things between us." Mina looked up, her face unreadable. "No, Ria. I finally understand them." There was no anger, no sarcasm, just finality. And that terrified Ria more than shouting ever could. That night, Mina opened her old cupboard. Inside, wrapped in a cloth, were her husband's diaries, pages filled with notes, receipts, property records. She placed them neatly into a new file, labeled in careful letters. For Advocate Deshmukh, personal. Then she turned off the light, lay down, and whispered into the dark. "Tomorrow I begin again." Sighed, the fog lifted slightly. For the first time in months, the moonlight touched her face, soft, unbroken. The storm had not ended. It had only learned to wait for morning. There's a strange sound that comes before everything breaks. It isn't a crash. It's silence. The kind that hangs heavy in the air like a held breath, right before truth decides it's tired of hiding. That silence lived in our house for weeks. Followed Ria from room to room, from phone call to phone call, like a shadow that finally found its voice. I didn't have to lift a finger anymore. Time had started doing my work for me. The lawyer, Advocate Deshmukh, came quietly one morning. I remember Ria's eyes when she saw him standing by the gate. Her face went pale, then recovered in seconds. "Ma, what's this about? Why did you call a lawyer?" she asked. I smiled gently. "Oh, it's nothing serious. Just wanted to make sure your husband's father's will was updated correctly. You know, after all, this is still his house." Her expression didn't falter, but I saw her throat move when she swallowed. My son was at work that day, and I had planned it that way. Inside the living room, the air smelled faintly of sandalwood and something burning. Maybe nerves, maybe karma. Deshmukh opened the file I'd given him. "Madam," he said, looking at Ria, "according to these papers, this property was placed in a family trust by your late father-in-law. The ownership passes only through his wife, not his son." The words hung there, quiet and absolute. Ria didn't blink. She only stared at me, a long, cold stare that used to make me shrink. But not anymore. 'Cause that day I realized something. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It whispers. When Deshmukh left, she followed him outside, pretending calm. But later that night, I heard her talking fast on the phone, whispering words like forged, mistake, possible delay. She didn't know I was standing by the kitchen door. I didn't need to record anything. I didn't need proof anymore. Because every lie she spoke now was proof enough, not for the courts, but for him. My son. He began to notice things, small things. The missing bills. The unpaid taxes. The lies about my medical condition. How Ria once told him I refused treatment when she'd hidden the reports herself. Truth has a way of seeping through even the smallest cracks. One evening, he asked me quietly, "Ma, did you ever tell Ria you'd transfer the property to us?" I shook my head. He looked down for a long time. When he lifted his eyes again, I saw a man torn between guilt and loyalty. I didn't comfort him. Some lessons I'd learned are only understood through silence. A few days later, the social worker returned, the same one who once believed Ria's tears. She looked different now, embarrassed, maybe wiser. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I've been reviewing your case. I didn't know the full story before." "I'm so sorry." I smiled. "That's all right, Beta. People see what they're shown, and Ria had been very good at showing. But masks don't last long under the weight of truth." That week, Ria's friend, the banker who once came to dinner, called my son directly. He wanted to confirm a few details about a loan application. Apparently, someone had tried to use this house as collateral without the owner's written consent. My son froze. He didn't say a word to me that night, but his silence was louder than any accusation. Ria noticed it too. For the first time, she couldn't fill the house with her voice. She moved slower, spoke softer, watched me like someone studying an opponent she underestimated. And in a way, I pitied her. 'Cause I remembered being her once, young, proud, believing control was love and manipulation was strength. But life has a cruel way of teaching the difference. One evening, as I watered the plants in the courtyard, Ria came out. The sun was setting, that soft orange hour that makes everything look honest. She stood behind me and said quietly, "You're turning my husband against me." I didn't turn around. I just kept watering the jasmine, its scent sharp in the air. "No," I said finally, "you did that yourself." There was no anger in my tone. Just truth, heavy and unpolished. She didn't reply. She just stood there, breathing hard before walking back inside. That was the last time she ever tried to threaten me. After that, the days grew strangely peaceful. My son stopped avoiding me. He brought tea to my room in the mornings. Sometimes we sat together without talking, the silence between us no longer cruel but tender, repairing itself slowly. Then, one morning, he said, "Ma, Ria's gone to her parents for a while. She needs time." I nodded. I didn't ask why. 'Cause sometimes absence speaks louder than any confession. For weeks, the house felt lighter. I cleaned the rooms, reopened the windows, and let sunlight touch corners that had stayed dark for too long. Every evening, I sat by the veranda, watching the street fill with children returning from school. Their laughter was loud, alive. And I thought, maybe peace doesn't come when people change. Maybe it comes when you do. But the story wasn't over. Because forgiveness is never the final act. It's only the intermission before truth finishes its work. A month later, a man came to the door with an envelope. "Registered post for Mrs. Meena Rao," he said. I signed it and opened it slowly. Inside was a bank statement, Ria's name, a new account, and a transfer, 50,000 rupees withdrawn the day she left. From my pension account. I didn't feel anger. I felt understanding. Because that's who she was, she couldn't stop taking. But now I no longer needed to stop her. The world was already closing in on its own. The next week she called my son, crying. Her family had discovered her loans, her fake documents. Police were involved. She begged him for help. And my son, my boy who once believed her over me, said only 4 words. "Talk to my mother." When he handed me the phone, I didn't gloat. I just said softly, "Ria, you made choices. Now life is simply collecting its debt." She sobbed quietly, words tumbling between regret and fear. But I had nothing left to give her, not even anger. 'Cause you cannot teach someone empathy by being their victim. When I hung up, I sat by the window for a long time. The same window where months ago I'd watched my dignity unravel. Now I watched the sun rise again, spilling gold across the walls. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt free. But something inside me still whispered, softly, insistently. It wasn't enough to be free. I needed to make sure she could never hurt anyone else the way she hurt me. So I called Advocate Deshmukh again. He picked up with a quiet warmth. "Mrs. Rao," he said, "what can I do for you today?" I smiled faintly. "Something simple," I said. "Let's make sure no one can touch this house again. Ever." And with that, I set the final piece of my justice in motion. 'Cause revenge, I learned, doesn't mean destruction. Sometimes it simply means building something no one can take from you again. I used to believe endings were loud, that they came with shouting, broken glass, and tears. But life taught me something gentler. Endings don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they come like dusk, slow, graceful, almost beautiful in their finality. It was on one of those evenings when the story truly ended. Not with anger, but with truth. Ria came back to the house after 2 months. She didn't look like herself anymore. The woman who once walked through rooms like she owned the air now stepped carefully, like a guest unsure of her welcome. My son opened the door for her. He didn't smile. He didn't scold her either. He simply said, "Ma's in the garden," and walked away. I was sitting by the old neem tree, feeding the stray dog that visited every afternoon. When I saw her, I didn't flinch. Her face was pale, thinner than I remembered, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. For a moment, I almost felt sorry. "Ma," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I made mistakes. I was scared of losing control." I looked at her hands, restless, cold, empty. "Control," I repeated quietly. "It's a strange thing to lose when you never really had it." She blinked hard, fighting tears. "I was wrong. About you. About everything." Her voice cracked on that last word. I nodded slowly. "I know," I said. And I meant it. But forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't something you give to erase pain. Something you give to release yourself from it. So I forgave her, not for her sake, but for mine. Later that night, my son came into my room. He stood by the doorway for a long time, just looking at me. Then, quietly, he said, "I should have listened to you, Ma. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say you hurt me. I simply said, now you know why I stayed silent. 'Cause silence, when chosen, can be the loudest truth of all." He nodded, tears catching in his eyes. I hadn't seen him cry since he was a child. When he finally spoke again, his voice was soft. "I thought I was protecting her, but I was just running from guilt." I smiled faintly. "We all protect something, Beta. Some protect lies. Others protect peace." He knelt beside my chair then, holding my hand as if trying to memorize it. And in that quiet room, for the first time in years, I felt like his mother again. Not a burden, not an inconvenience. Just, Ma. A few weeks later, I signed the final papers. The house was placed in my husband's trust with one clear condition. After my passing, it would become a shelter for widowed women, women who had nowhere else to go. When I told my son, he didn't argue. He simply said, "You're building something beautiful, Ma." And I replied, "No, Beta. I'm just returning what was never mine to keep." 'Cause this house, the walls, the memories, the laughter, and the pain, had always belonged to something larger than us. It had belonged to the lessons we left behind. Ria moved out soon after. There was no drama, no shouting. Just a quiet departure at dawn. She left behind a note on the kitchen table. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you find peace. I am trying to find mine." I folded it carefully and placed it inside my husband's diary. Not as a reminder of betrayal, but as proof that even broken people can learn to whisper truth eventually. Months passed. The seasons softened. The neem tree outside bloomed again, its flowers scattering like small white confessions on the courtyard floor. I started teaching neighborhood children under its shade. Nothing formal, just stories, poems, lessons about kindness and boundaries. They called me Aji, grandmother. Their laughter filled spaces that once held silence. And sometimes in that laughter I heard echoes of my younger self, the woman who once believed silence was weakness. Now I knew better. Silence can be grace. It can also be power. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, my son sat beside me again. He looked at me with a kind of peace I hadn't seen in years. "Ma," he said, "I used to think strength was shouting the loudest. But you showed me it's something else." I smiled, eyes fixed on the fading light. "Strength," I said softly, "is when your pain no longer needs witnesses." He didn't reply. He just placed his hand on mine, and together we watched the day end, quiet, steady, complete. Strange the way life circles back. The way the same walls that once held tears can later hold forgiveness. The same son who once turned away can learn to look at you again, not with guilt but with understanding. And the same silence that once broke you can become your final peace. When people ask me now if I regret anything, I tell them this: no. 'Cause sometimes losing everything is how you find yourself again. Now, when I sit by the window, the same one I once watched through as my world fell apart, I don't see pain anymore. I see a house filled with stories. Some broken, some whole. All mine. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can almost hear my husband's voice again, warm and steady. "Mina, you were never meant to fight them. You were meant to outlast them." He was right. I didn't win by shouting. I won by standing still. That night, as the lamps flickered and the city fell quiet, I whispered the final truth to myself, the one that had taken a lifetime to learn. Some children forget who raised them. But time always remembers. And in that soft, endless silence, I finally found what I had been searching for all along. Not revenge. Not apology. Just peace. 'Cause some goodbyes don't break you. They set you free. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.